So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have author and Minnesota historian Greg Gaut with us this evening to share with us about his new book. If you enjoy programs like this, please let us know. We'll do what we can to try to bring more here to New Ulm and make things available for you. But with that, I'll just go ahead and let Greg take it away.
Good. Thank you, Leroy. And I want to thank the New Ulm Public Library for having me. Actually, this is the second time I've been here. Leroy said it was maybe about 8 years ago, actually talking about this same project, but in a very early stage of it. So this is a book about what happened in Minnesota during World War I on the home front. And a long time ago, I started thinking I was going to write something about this, just about one small aspect of it, which was the Home Guard, which I'll mention in a little bit. And somehow I ended up speaking here, and it made perfect sense to be speaking in New Ulm because New Ulm is actually a real center point for this whole story, as we'll hear more about in a little bit. So eventually I kept working on it. It's been about 12 years, I think I was working on this project, and eventually Minnesota Historical Society Press took it up and published it, and so I'm really happy to be talking about it. A number of people, I feel like when I wrote a book like this that I was kind of standing on the shoulders of a lot of historians that have already done a lot of work on this area. One of whom is Dan Hoisington, who's done a lot of work in New Ulm, who wrote some stuff that really helped me. And also my wife, Marcia Neff, who's sitting here in the first row, has been a great help through the whole process in terms of an editor, etc. So I want to say how this idea occurred to me, and it goes back to when I was a graduate student a long time ago in history. I studied modern European and modern Russian history. Does that sound okay?
I just want to be sure, they're a little hard of hearing, I want to be sure they can hear you.
I'm good. I can just crank it up.
Okay.
All right,
Okay.
well, just let me know.
Sometimes you get softer, huh?
Okay, so I studied modern European and modern Russian history, and then I taught those subjects on the college level for a long time. And if you are kind of immersed in the study of modern European and modern Russian history, the significance of World War I is always very evident. You think about the massive carnage, 10 million soldiers and millions of civilians died, a generation of traumatized veterans, many disabled and horribly disfigured, the collapse of 4 different empires, the Russian, the Habsburg, the German, and the Ottoman empires, redrawing the map of all of Europe and the Middle East, for better or for worse. Even the victorious powers, Britain, France, and Italy, were weakened by the war, even though they supposedly won. Mass killing was essentially industrialized and in a sense normalized. And then of course all this set the stage for the coming of fascism. So from a European point of view, there's nothing more significant than World War I. It's really incredible. But when I started reading more Minnesota history, including sort of general surveys of Minnesota history, I was always surprised that they seemed to like just sort of jump over World War I as if it was no big deal. And I said to myself, that can't be right. I mean, that just can't be right. And early on in my study of this, I read a book by David Kennedy, who's a major US historian. He wrote a book called about the home front in World War I called Over Here, which is, it's really a clever title actually for a book about the home front, Over Here. And in that book he said, Americans went to war in 1917 not only against Germans in the fields of France, but against each other at home. What happened on the home front, he said, was a deadly serious contest to determine the consequences of the crisis for the character of the American economic, social, and political life. And that sounded more right to me. And what he had in mind was all the things that were going on in this country in 1914 when World War I broke out. So here's a short list. First, there was a jarring transition going on to a new stage of capitalism, an industrial capitalism dominated by large corporations and trusts. There was a mass migration from Europe going on and a nativist backlash against it. There was astounding economic inequality, which had begun in the Gilded Age. There was the rise of militant trade unionism, including the Industrial Workers of the World. There was populist farmer organizations. There was the rise of the Socialist Party led by Eugene Debs. There was the great migration of African Americans from south to north. And connected with that, the rise of the NAACP and other organizations to fight Jim Crow, discrimination, and lynching. There was the final push of the women's suffrage movement for voting rights. And then on top of all that, there was the movement for prohibition of alcohol production and sale. So this is what was going on in 1914 in this country. So do you think when the war broke out in Europe in 1914 that all of these things just stopped? No, they didn't stop. They continued. And that set the stage for what was going to happen during the war years. So my question was, how did this all play out in Minnesota? And it turned out, I think, and this is sort of the basic thesis of my book, that Minnesota was one of the hot spots of what I call the war at home, hence the title of the book, which is the struggle for the home front. Not only because of all those conflicts, which were all going on in Minnesota, to one stage or one extent or another, but also because the war itself was controversial, especially in states like Minnesota and Wisconsin, for example. In the period between the outbreak of war in Europe, which was July 1914, and the U.S. entry into the war, which was April 1917, there was an intense debate that raged throughout the country about whether the U.S. should enter the war in Europe. On the one hand, you had the neutrality movement, and on the other hand, you had what was called the preparedness movement, which was basically prepare for war. And they fought it out all across the nation and in Minnesota also. Minnesota, for all these reasons, was a deeply polarized state in this period. So this is what the book's about, the battles that raged in Minnesota during the war, when the state government for a short time, I think, was one of the most repressive in the nation. I was interested in the impact this had on the state, but I was also interested in, I'll get back to this a little bit later, on how it changed the lives of individuals. How did it happen that Minnesota played this role during World War I? So I think the starting point is, and of course I've already forgotten to advance the slide, so this is something just to remind us about World War I. It's not a pretty picture ever. Okay, so I don't forget, I'll put that up. The first thing I found is that in the Twin Cities, the business community was a highly organized and highly unified group of people, led by the grain millers, led by the big banks. There was actually two big banks, by manufacturers, etc. They tended to have a common heritage. That is to say, they were what we call Yankees. That is to say, men of English or Scottish origin who tended to worship in the same churches, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Congregationalist. They lunched at the Minneapolis Club, and here it is. It's still there in downtown Minneapolis, although it's not quite the same place as it was then. They golfed at the Minnetonka Club. They formed organizations which were committed to keeping unions out of the state. That was their main goal, and they were doing really well at it, fighting for what they called the open shop, that is to say, a shop without a union contract. They were very effective and very successful. But in 1916, during this period of debate about whether to go to war or not, three things happened that really kind of scared them. The first was some wildcat labor struggles. First up, in the north, among the on the Iron Range, there was a wildcat strike of iron miners against U.S. Steel. And a little bit later, there was another strike, and that strike didn't last very long. It was put down. And then a little bit later, there was another strike also up north among lumberjacks. In both those strikes, the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, set up some of their key organizers and basically led the strikes. This was very scary to the business class in Minneapolis-St. Paul. The International Workers of the World were building this base among these mostly immigrant populations of miners and lumberjacks. That was number one. The second thing was, in 1916, to their horror, Minneapolis elected a socialist as mayor, Tom Van Leer. And he really was a socialist. He was a member of the Socialist Party, very open about it, but he was also a very pragmatic socialist. So although he was very clear that in the long run, he hoped for a socialist revolution, in the short run, he promised the population that what he would work really hard on was dealing with the Twin City Transit Company and trying to get a better deal, and so that the fares on the streetcars wouldn't be so high. So that was very popular. So this was Tom Van Leer, and he didn't have a great deal of power as mayor, but he had one power, and that is the power over the police department. And this also really scared the business leaders, because what if there was a big strike in Minneapolis and a socialist was in control of the police department? So that was number 2. The third thing was actually the thing that scared them most. And that was people like this. So in 1916, this new farmer organization called the Nonpartisan League came to power in North Dakota. Won the governorship and won control of the House of in North Dakota, and shortly after that won control of the Senate in North Dakota and started putting their program into action. The Nonpartisan League was the latest in a long line of farmer populist organizations. This was started by a guy named Arthur Townley and some other people in North Dakota. And their idea was that they were getting basically screwed by the grain millers in Minneapolis, St. Paul, by the Pillsburys and the Washburns and the Crosbys, etc. And what they wanted to do was basically to even the playing field. They were not socialists, they were farmers, entrepreneurs, who just wanted to get a better deal because they thought they were really dealing with an impossible situation of this monopoly that was controlling things, or this oligarchy that was controlling their industry in St. Paul. So they wanted things like state-owned grain elevators and state-provided crop insurance, better deals with the railroads, etc. And so they thought the best way to do this was to get power take power and use the power of the state government to improve their situation. It was called the Nonpartisan League because their basic tactic was to run in the open primaries of the existing parties, which practically speaking usually meant the Republican Party, because the Democratic Party in North Dakota and Minnesota was relatively weak. And so that's how they had come to power in North Dakota, by winning primaries through the Republicans, sort of taking over the Republican Party, so to speak. After they won the election November 1916 in North Dakota, they made it very clear that they wanted to do Minnesota next, and they moved their national office to downtown St. Paul. So this was extremely troubling to the people who were running the grain industry, for example, in Minneapolis. So these things were all going on, and then we have the war, also very controversial at the same time. So in March of 1917, remember the U.S. Declared war on Germany in April of 1917, but about a month before that, when it seemed clear that the U.S. was about to go to war against Germany, the business community got itself together and went to the legislature with a proposal, a bill to set up what was called the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. So the thing was this: the Minnesota at that time had a biennial legislature, and the legislature in April of 1917 was about to adjourn and not meet again for 2 years. And so the idea was to get the legislature to quickly pass this bill for the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, which would be a committee of 7 people that would have the power to run the state for the duration of the war and have complete power to do that. It would be composed of the governor, the attorney general, and 5 members that the governor appointed. And all those people, except for one, tended to be conservative Republican businessmen. The one who wasn't was actually John Lind, well known in New Ulm, who was actually a former Democratic governor. So he was really the oddball out, and he didn't last very long on the committee, for it's a whole other story. But anyway, that was their idea. Now the person, there they are, by the way. This is a later version of them after there have been some changes. It was the governor, the attorney general, and 5 others. But this is the one who was important. John McGee was a lawyer in Minneapolis. He had been a district court judge, but he had retired from being a judge because he wanted to make more money as a private attorney, representing the railroads, the grain industry, that kind of thing. Extremely conservative, really shared with the business community their hate for the Socialist Party, the Wobblies, the trade unions, and the Nonpartisan League. And he had really kind of an extreme ideology. What I want to do is just read a little bit of him. There's all kinds of things in the book about John McGee, because he's really a central figure in this whole thing. But in 1918, he was invited to Washington, D.C. to testify at a Senate hearing. A conservative senator had introduced a bill to take the sedition cases under the Espionage Act out of the federal courts and move them into military courts. So essentially making it kind of a martial law thing where if you spoke out against the war, you could be tried in a military court. And John McGee was all for this. This is the kind of thing he was for. So he testified, and when he testified in Congress, here's what he said. Where we made a mistake was in not establishing a firing squad in the first days of the war. We should now get busy and have the firing squad working overtime. These men who are fighting against our soldiers this side of the water and stabbing them in the back are going to die. All socialists should be in internment camps. This was a public statement. He said a lot of other things privately that were very much like that. But it kind of gives you an idea of what John McGee was like. Now, the commission was 7 people, and the governor was on it. And you might think the governor would be the leader of it, but that's not what happened. The governor was only 34 years old, and John McGee was a pretty hardened lawyer, and he had a powerful personality, and he also had a very strong agenda. He essentially became the leader of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety and basically ran the show. And what he tried to do right away was to set up a number of institutions to give the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety the power to exert itself around the state. And this is where the Home Guard comes in, which I was interested in from the beginning of this. So here was the deal. When the U.S. declared war on Germany, the federal government federalized all of the state National Guards. And so there was 4 units of the Minnesota National Guard, 3 infantry and 1 field artillery. They all were immediately federalized and sent to Camp Cody in New Mexico to train to be part of a new division in formation that eventually would go to France. And everybody knew this was going to happen because there had been a law passed the year before that would allow the president to do that. Keep in mind that when the U.S. went to war against Germany, the U.S. had practically no army, a very small standing army. And so there was that standing army, and then there was all the National Guard units from around the country that were federalized, and then there was a selective service system set up to draft millions of men for an additional army. But in the short run, the National Guard was an important part of that. So they knew the National Guard would be gone, and the business community had thought of the National Guard as kind of their last line of defense when there was a difficult strike. Call out the National Guard. Now they're gone. Plus there's a socialist mayor in Minneapolis. So what they did was they created a new kind of National Guard called the Home Guard, which was made up of volunteers, primarily businessmen, who were older than draft age, but not too old, and they formed units all around the state. Eventually there was 21 battalions of the Home Guard, and they were basically ready to act when called upon by the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. We'll see them coming into play in a little bit. So that was one thing. In addition to that, there was another group of businessmen who volunteered their automobiles. So this is 1917. A lot of, especially middle-class people had cars. A lot of farmers had cars too. And so a big auto dealer in downtown Minneapolis said, what if we get a bunch of guys to volunteer to form a motor corps, bringing their cars with them? And they did, and they did the same thing, kind of a version of the Home Guard, 10 battalions, over 2,400 businessmen and their automobiles. In 1918, they had a training camp at Lake City. The Minnesota National Guard at that time had a training camp near Lake City, and a bunch of them showed up with their cars to practice crowd control and strike breaking or whatever they were doing out there. And there you see them warming up their cars during that training session. The Commission for Public Safety also had its own police officers, and it also had the support of most of the sheriffs around the state. So it's hard to say exactly how many. There was, at the time, 86 counties. There's 87 now, but there was 86 then. Most of the sheriffs were on board and willing to do whatever the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety thought was necessary. And some of them formed their own kind of local home guards, sometimes called rural guards, who were sort of standing posses, so to speak. There was also patriotic organizations supporting the Commission for Public Safety, the Stars and Stripes League, the American First Association, the Labor's Loyalty League. There was more of these all the time being created. And finally, and most bizarrely, there was the American Protective League. So this is actually probably the single strangest story of the whole period. Back then, this is before the FBI existed, the Department of Justice had a Bureau of Investigation, but it had very few people in it. And so a businessman in Chicago organized a group of guys who wanted to be kind of amateur sleuths, amateur detectives, whatever, organized them into a body. And he went to the Department of Justice and to Attorney General Gregory, his name was, and said, we will work with you. We'll provide this organization of volunteer detectives all around the country to root out the disloyal and draft slackers and whatever. And what do you think? And the federal government said, yeah, that would be fine. And we even gave them badges. You see this badge says American Protective League Secret Service. So these guys who had no qualifications, had been vetted by nobody, and were giving these badges, selective service, and they went around opening mail, arresting people, doing all kinds of things all around the country. It's one of the most bizarre parts of the whole story. In Minneapolis, the Minneapolis business community thought this is a great idea, so they organized a local branch of the American Protective League, and they said they claimed they had about 250 agents in Minneapolis alone, or maybe it was Hennepin County alone. And it was arranged for them to have an office in the federal building, even though this is completely just an independent, essentially vigilante organization. They had their own office in the federal building. This is kind of, I think, symptomatic of the period. It was a little crazy. Anyway, by midsummer of 1917, all of these things were starting to come into place, or a little bit later after that, they're coming into place. So the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety had quite a collection of forces that it could apply. The period was a period of constant conflict, especially after this event, and the event that in fact happened right here. So this was kind of the spark that really set things out. So in July of 1917, there was a rally here in New Ulm, near Turner Hall, and it was provoked by the Selective Service Act, by conscription. So when the war broke out, as I mentioned, the U.S. had very little army, and Woodrow Wilson had always said he was opposed to conscription, but as soon as the war broke out, he brought a bill to Congress to create the Selective Service system. It was very controversial, and there was a lot of debate in Congress that didn't pass very easily at all. But eventually it did pass, and in June there was a mass registration day. I mean, one of the problems that the Selective Service system had was they didn't have any names. So they had to get people to register. So people registered on June 6th. And in July, there was the first calls for counties started to find out, like Brown County found out how many men it was going to need to draft in the next month or so. So now the issue of conscription really came home right here in New Ulm, and it was extremely troubling because many people here well knew, not just in the abstract, but in actual concrete reality, that their own relatives that they knew well were in the German army, and some of them were actually at the front in France. So that if they were drafted and were sent to France and fighting in the trenches, they wouldn't just be kind of maybe fighting against their relatives, they could be actually fighting against their relatives. It was really, really troubling. And so a number of young men came to two of the leaders of New Ulm at that time, the mayor, Louis Ritchie, and Albert Feinder, the city attorney, and what can we do, what can we do? So they decided to have a meeting, and the idea was that, okay, Congress had passed the Selective Service system, but was it really constitutional? Could you really do that? Could you really draft people and send them abroad? And so they put together a petition that said, we support the draft, we're not opposing anything, but we ask that the government reconsider this and if people are going to be drafted, that people who are drafted not be sent abroad unless they volunteered to do so. That was their kind of compromise idea. And they thought this was a reasonable thing to bring up. So there was a rally, and Louis Ritchie and Albert Feinder spoke, and also two other men who were important leaders in town, Albert Steinhauser, who was the editor of the newspaper, and Reverend Adolf Ackerman, who was the president of Martin Luther College. And they all spoke in favor of this, and some of them actually said more things that got them in trouble also. So Faender said, and Fainder's the city attorney, he's a lawyer. He was very careful. He said, if you're called to the draft, you must go, etc. But we think we can reasonably, peacefully ask for this reform, and they were hoping that might work out. But some of the other speakers, and maybe he said this too, said along the way in their speeches that, if there had been a referendum on the war, on whether to go to war or not, we wouldn't be at war now. And that was a very dangerous thing to say. The Minnesota Commission on Public Safety heard that, and they said, oh, these guys, no, these guys are disloyal. They're opposed to the war because they're questioning whether there was popular support for the war. Well, in Minnesota, there wasn't popular support for the war. In Brown County, there certainly wasn't popular support for the war. But anyway, they said it. And that was really maybe their undoing. So what happened, and by the way, I should say, these two guys, you look at guys like this and they're supposedly opposing the war in the draft, and some people might say, oh, here's two more pacifists. No. These guys are both majors in the Minnesota National Guard. And Albert Faender had just come back from 8 months leading the New Ulm National Guard on the border of Mexico during this incursion into Mexico, looking for Pancho Villa, et cetera, et cetera. He'd just come back from 8 really hard months, leading his troops, his Minnesota National Guard troops on the Mexican border. And Louis Fritchie was the second in command of the medical unit for the Minnesota National Guard. Albert Steinhauser was a Purple Heart veteran of the Spanish-American War. So this is who these people were. And in fact, New Ulm had a really rich tradition of participating in the National Guard up until that time. They just built a new armory here. Well, in any case, the Minnesota Commission on Public Safety came down really hard on these guys. Because it was kind of the beginning of this, they wanted to flex their muscles. And so they used their power to depose Fritchie and Faender. In other words, take them out of office. And they were no longer the mayor or the city attorney. Albert Steinhauser was a private citizen, the editor of the newspaper. They couldn't do anything to him generally, but they eventually prevailed on the U.S. attorney to charge him under the Espionage Act with sedition. He was eventually charged. Adolf Ackerman, the president of Martin Luther College, they couldn't depose him directly either, but the Minnesota Commission on Public Safety leaned really hard on the board of Martin Luther College and said, you've got to get rid of this guy. You can't have a disloyal man as mayor, or as your president, or something terrible is going to happen. And eventually the board crumbled and fired him. So this was the beginning. And after this, things really were full of conflict for the rest of the period. This kind of broke the sort of truce that had happened up until July of 1917, and after that, things really got really testy. And I wanted to just mention two of those big conflicts, although there's many other things that we could say, but I'm just mention two of them. One of them was this, a strike. So in the fall of 1917, a strike broke out in Minneapolis and St. Paul for the transit system. And you may know that at this time, the Minneapolis and St. Paul had one huge streetcar system that eventually stretched from Lake Minnetonka all the way out to White Bear Lake. You could take a streetcar from one way all the way to the other. But it was all owned by a private company that had a concession with the cities. And in October of 1917, some of the trainmen who worked for the Minnesota Transit Company started to try to organize a union. And the company came down really hard on them, fired them all, et cetera, and we started this whole conflict around this union struggle to organize the transit union in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And eventually the whole labor movement in the Twin Cities backed this, and it got very testy. There were some times when there was some vandalism of streetcars downtown, et cetera. And in response to that, the Commission for Public Safety sided completely with the company and brought in the Home Guard. What I mean by the Home Guard was units of the Home Guard from various places like Owatonna, Winona, Anoka, came in on trains to St. Paul and basically took over downtown St. Paul to protect the transit company's property. You see they have pistols and clubs. By this time it was December, so they're a little cold, that's why they're all bundled up like that. And so eventually the strike ended without a union being formed or a union contract. And it was an interesting thing, but that happens here is that the Commission for Public Safety basically sided with the union, sided with the company and said, there can be no changes in any labor agreements during the course of the war. The federal government actually had a completely different idea, and they sent mediators to St. Paul to try to mediate between the company and the union. And the federal government's attitude was, well, it's really important to keep the streetcars going because to keep war production going, so let's mediate some sort of settlement, and if the settlement includes a union contract, well, that's fine. But that wasn't the Commission of Public Safety's idea at all. So the federal mediators came in, they proposed that, and the company just said, so what? See you later, we don't care, we're not doing anything. So the strike eventually failed. However, the strike is still really important because the Nonpartisan League, which by this time was organizing all around the state, came in and supported the trade union movement in Minneapolis-St. Paul during the strike. And so now you have the beginnings of the farmers organized by the Nonpartisan League, which was a lot of farmers around the state, and the trade union in Minneapolis-St. Paul beginning to form a coalition, an alliance. And this did not result in a successful strike, but eventually that alliance would evolve and develop, and in a couple of years it would become the Farmer Labor Party, which then controlled, say, the governorship throughout the 1930s, became a very powerful party. One of the few third parties in the United States that actually became a really significant force. Anyway, that was that event, and now I want to mention one other event, kind of the climax of all the struggles. And that had to do with Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. Okay, so he was the 6th district. He represented the 6th district in Congress from 1907 to 1917. He was a lawyer from Little Falls, and the 6th district included Little Falls and Morrison County and a bunch of counties in the middle of the state, all the way up to the Canadian border. And so I mentioned that the Nonpartisan League had said it wanted to try to do what it had just done in North Dakota and Minnesota. And what was happening was that there was going to be a primary in the Republican Party in June of 1918, and the governor was going to have, the sitting governor was Governor Burnquist, who was a member of the Commission for Public Safety, was going to have to run in that primary. So they nominated Charles Lindbergh Sr., who by this time had retired from Congress, to be their candidate for governor in this incredible campaign that went on in May and June 1918 throughout the state. Now, I just want to mention that you notice that I say Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., a very important distinction to make. The person that most people know as Charles A. Lindbergh is really Charles A. Lindbergh Jr., the aviator, who was the son of Charles Lindbergh Sr. But this is the father. And at this time, Charles Lindbergh Jr. was a teenager. He actually helped his father campaign. His father, he drove, even though he was like 14, he drove his father's car around the state when they were campaigning. But that was it. He was just a teenager at that point. He didn't play any real political role. And nobody knew in 1917 that he was 10 years later going to be maybe the most famous person in the world. That was a whole other thing that happened later, okay? So this is Charles Lindbergh Sr. So what happened was an incredible campaign. By this time, all around the state, the Commission for Public Safety, the sheriffs, the Home Guard, everything, they were really making it very difficult for the Nonpartisan League to even have a meeting. There was at least 20 counties that absolutely banned the Nonpartisan League meeting, much less campaigning. And when the campaign started, it got worse and worse. So Lindbergh would try to come and have the common Nonpartisan League event would be some farmer's farm. They'd come and have a huge picnic, and then the speaker, Lindbergh or some other speaker would address, a couple thousand farmers on some farm field. But this was becoming more and more difficult, to do. And at one point, about a week before the primary, Lindbergh was actually arrested by a county attorney in Martin County because Martin County had said that the Nonpartisan League was not allowed to speak in Martin County, and if Lindbergh was speaking for the Nonpartisan League, he was under arrest. And they actually arrested him while he was campaigning. This is the way it got. And so, actually, here's a good picture of Lindbergh campaigning in some farm. So it was a remarkable amount of violence during this campaign, and really out of all the research I did, the thing that surprised me most was the enormous animosity between townspeople and farmers throughout southern and Minnesota, western Minnesota, all the way up to the North Dakota border. It was remarkable. So when a farmer would come into town with his car with a Lindbergh sign on it, somebody would come, rip it off, throw things at him. Fist fights broke out. It was a good thing that there were so few firearms back then, because there was an enormous amount of violence. Townspeople were just hated the nonpartisan league, and the farmers were getting more and more upset with the townspeople. It's really kind of a strange thing, because they were mutually dependent on each other, but it really got ugly. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. Towards the end of the campaign, one of the things the Nonpartisan League did was they organized these big car caravans. A lot of farmers had cars, and the Nonpartisan League organizers also had these Model T Fords that the party had bought. And so they would organize car caravans of hundreds of cars, sometimes 300 or 400 cars, and they would drive through counties, kind of campaigning. This is the last week before the primary election. And when they come into a town, there would often be trouble. People would rip off the things, there'd be things thrown, etc. One town actually put a barricade up on the road coming into town to keep them from coming in. It was constant conflict and low levels of violence, and that's the way the campaign went. Governor Burnquist basically said, I'm not going to talk about any issue. There's only one issue in this campaign, and that's loyalty. And Charles Lindbergh is a traitor. He's pro-German. He wants the Kaiser to win the war, blah, blah, blah. And I represent loyalty, and if you want us to win the war and be loyal, you have to vote for me. This whole campaign was based on that. The Nonpartisan League and Lindbergh said that they supported the war and the draft, and even the Liberty Bond campaigns. In North Dakota, which was controlled by the Nonpartisan League, they exceeded their quotas in terms of buying Liberty Bonds to finance the war. But Lindbergh had been opposed to the war before it started, and that was very clear. And the Nonpartisan League and Lindbergh shared this, and this sort of many people in the trade union movement too, which they said was, okay, look, if we support conscription, we're not going to oppose the selective service system, conscription. If you're going to have conscription, okay, that's fine. But if you're going to conscript men and send them over to France to fight, then you should also conscript wealth to finance the war. In other words, it was a basic disagreement about how the war should be financed. And from the point of view of people like Lindbergh and the Nonpartisan League and the trade union movement, the wealthy, remember now in this society that's huge differentials of wealth, that the wealthy should pay a bigger part of the ticket for the war. And because after all, Lindbergh would say, it was the war they wanted anyway, not us. You know, we're willing to support it now, but it was J.P. Morgan who wanted the war, so they should pay a bigger part of the fare. So that also led the Minnesota Commissioner of Public Safety to say, look, they really aren't loyal, even though they say they are, even though they say they support the war. They're critical of the war in these various sort of ways. Well, in any case, Lindbergh did not win. And Burnquist won. He got 47% of the vote. Lindbergh got 30% of the vote. And here's an interesting map that shows where Lindbergh did well and where he didn't, which really gives you an idea of how the Nonpartisan League was doing. So they had about 50,000 paid up members, but Lindbergh got about 150,000 votes, which is 43%. And he carried 30 counties, which are the counties shaded in dark. And so you can kind of get a sense. So you see up in the Red River Valley, which was more wheat farmers, which were very similar to the North Dakota farmers across the border. They carried all those counties. The Nonpartisan League was really strong up there. And then along the Minnesota River, they carried quite a few of those counties. And those were counties where maybe the agriculture was a little bit more diverse, but the farmers tended to be more often German than not. And that kind of helped too. You notice though, near the Iowa border, the bottom two tiers of counties, Lindbergh didn't carry a single one. And I'm not exactly sure why that was, but he didn't do very well in those counties. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, or basically Hennepin County and Ramsey County, Burnquist carried both those counties, but in the cities, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, in wards that were primarily working class, Lindbergh did really well, carried them. In more middle class wards, it went the other way. So for example, I was looking at the Ramsey County, St. Paul election results, And in the ward that included Summit Avenue, Burnquist like overwhelmed Lindbergh, not surprisingly. But in working class wards, it went the other way. So when I looked at these election results more closely, you see something really interesting. And this kind of connects with what I said about the animosity between the farmers and the townspeople. The voting results are broken down by towns and then by townships. So if there was an organized town, like New Ulm or St. James, that would be shown that way, and otherwise the farmers are basically voting in townships. And generally what you see is that in the towns, the vote is overwhelmingly for Burnquist, and right outside the city limits, where the township starts, the vote is overwhelmingly for Lindbergh, especially in those counties that Lindbergh carried. Now down here, for example, I was speaking over at St. James earlier today, so I put this together. This is the results for Watonwan County. And the two of the yellow ones that I highlighted there are the Burnquist and Lindbergh. And you see that at the bottom, Burnquist overwhelmed Lindbergh. It was won really easily. And if you look at number 17 and 18, or excuse me, 18 and 19, the St. James city wards, you see exactly what I'm talking about. So a big margin for Burnquist in town. But even in Watonwan County that voted mostly for Burnquist, if you go back to some of the townships, you see sometimes a majority, small majority, sometimes a little bigger majority for Lindbergh. So even in those rural townships here, where I think the Nonpartisan League hadn't had much inroad yet, they were still getting a lot of votes for Lindbergh. See Madelia Village, 252 to 28. That was really typical town vote. That's the way the town votes tended to go. St. James, First Ward, 231 to 18. Second Ward, 179 to 25. There was only 43 people in St. James that was willing to vote for Lindbergh. Well, this is not surprising. I mean, basically all the newspapers, the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety, Burnquist was saying, if you vote for Lindbergh, you're a traitor. You're pro-German, you want the Kaiser to win. You better vote for Burnquist, or you're basically saying you want the Kaiser to win. That was a tough thing, but so many farmers said, no, we understand what's really going on here, and we're going to vote for Lindbergh anyway. Now, here in Brown County, not surprisingly, there was a kind of an exception. So look at the top. New Ulm was the only town I've ever seen that voted for Lindbergh. It's really very interesting. Not surprising, really. But look at that. First Ward, 200 for Lindbergh, 104 for Burnquist. Second Ward, 253 for Lindbergh, 65. Third Ward, 347 for Lindbergh, 65 for Burnquist. This is really unusual, and it probably is explained by the fact that so many people in New Ulm were really pissed off at what had just happened not too long before, when the Commissioner of Public Safety had removed their mayor and their city attorney, who were very popular. And by the way, as soon as the war was over, Louis Frischi was voted back in as mayor. He'd been removed by the Commissioner of Public Safety, but the people voted him right back in as soon as the war was over. And the first thing he did was appointed Albert Finger to be the city attorney. So I mean, that just shows you what's going on. But then you look at some of the townships, you see that kind of pattern. Really high vote for Lindbergh in the rural townships. That's pretty common. And so that's what I was seeing all across the state, which kind of reinforced what I was seeing in terms of the violence between town and farm. Within the towns, people overwhelmingly voting for Burnquist. As soon as you get outside the town, the vote switches completely the other way. So it's an interesting bit of kind of data, you could say. And, when we're trying to figure out what did people really think at that time, and it's hard because there wasn't like surveys and all these kind of things. So the vote totals are useful. Of course, now they're only so useful. People go to the poll; they have two choices: vote for Burnquist or vote for Lindbergh. But keep in mind how polarized it was. I mean, if you voted for Lindbergh, you had to really know what you were doing, because you were being accused of terrible things. You were a traitor, a Bolshevik, and all kinds of things, and yet many farmers really stuck, and also trade union people in the cities. So, okay, I'm going to move forward then. You can look at these a little longer later if you want. I just want to mention now that one other thing that I tried to do in the book was to focus on individuals. And I know this really has to do with all of us when you think about it. I mean, we all grow up in some particular context, and if we grew up somewhere else, our lives would be completely different. But we have the opportunities and also the limitations that come with whatever context we happen to be growing up in. And this is especially true, of course, in times of warfare. So think of now, for example, if you were yourself, except you happened to be a Ukrainian. Would your life have been different? Would your life have been the same as it always had been over the last 2 or 3 years? No, I mean, you get swept up in these historic events and it's like everything changes whether you like it or not. It's really kind of an interesting phenomenon. It's really true of all of us to one extent or another, but it's especially true during warfare, and that's what I'm kind of interested in. So what I did in the book is followed a number of characters. The main characters are two I've already mentioned. John McGee, because really he was the most powerful man in the state for the duration of the war, and Charles Lindbergh Sr., because he was, I think not only played this huge role, but I also think that Charles Lindbergh Sr. is a really important figure in Minnesota history that's been more or less forgotten, and he had the, kind of misfortune in a way of having the son that everybody knows, and his son kind of eclipsed him. It's like if you say Charles Lindbergh, I mean, that's, who would think that you're talking about Charles Lindbergh Sr. But Charles Lindbergh Sr. was a very important figure, and I think even more important now because he made a big name for himself nationally in Congress as fighting what he called the money trust, trying to bring reform to the banking system and to try to constantly try to figure out ways to lessen economic inequality in the U.S. And he wasn't very successful. It was really hard to do, but that's what he was known for. Here's some other people, though, I mentioned. Jens Grandal, what a character. He was the editor of the Red Wing Daily Republican. And kind of typical of these small-town newspaper editors. At this time there were 750 newspapers in Minnesota. It's amazing. So these newspapers are really interesting, and he was one of these entrepreneurs who started this newspaper. And before the war, he was all for neutrality. He thought the Europeans were crazy. He was an immigrant himself. But once the war started, he became kind of a flaming nationalist and wrote incredible editorials, kind of scary editorials. And like many of these local newspaper editors, it's very disappointing. I mean, they basically condoned mob violence. They said, oh yeah, there's freedom of speech, but not for them. That kind of thing. It was really, it's really interesting to watch what happens with some of these guys. Maria Sanford, some of you may know, she was kind of a legendary professor at the University of Minnesota, and kind of one of these progressives at the time who, before the war, really was down on militarism and down on going to war, but once the war started, she really kind of bought into the Woodrow Wilson line of supporting the war, which was that this is a war for democracy, a war to end all wars, and she kind of bought into that and became a big proponent of the war. Alice Ames Winter was the head of the Women's Auxiliary of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. So you probably know that in those days, there was all kinds of organizations in every town, the Elks, the Moose, the Masons, et cetera, and most of them were male organizations that then had a women's auxiliary. Well, the Commission for Public Safety, of course, followed the same model, so they had a women's auxiliary, a women's committee, and it was led by Alice Ames Winter, who was a very wealthy woman, well-known nationally. She had published 2 novels, and she ran this kind of pretty much autonomous women's committee separate from what was going on at the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. And after the war, she actually became the president of the National Federation of Women's Clubs. Clarence Wigington was an African-American architect in St. Paul, and you can see a lot of his buildings still in St. Paul as you go around, some of them in the National Register of Historic Places. He and some other friends of his in St. Paul were, like all African Americans, deeply troubled and angered by the complete segregation of the U.S. military and the Minnesota National Guard by race. And so this is a lot of stuff in the book is about the National Army and its segregation. But Wigington proposed to Governor Burnquist that there be an African American battalion of the Home Guard. It was called the 16th Battalion. And so there was 2 companies in Minneapolis and 2 companies in St. Paul. And he was the head of one of the companies, which is why he sometimes referred to it. He got the nickname Cap Wigington, which he had for the rest of his life, Clarence Cap Wigington. And so it was a painful thing in a way, because what they really wanted to do was to integrate the National Guard, but they thought maybe cracking the door open a little bit by at least having an African-American unit of the Home Guard would help. And in fact, it didn't help. It was a long time before the Minnesota National Guard was integrated. But anyway, that was partly what they tried to do. Sarah Tarleton Coleman was leader of the National Women's Party. So, as I mentioned, all those struggles that were going on before the war broke out, and those struggles had a big impact on these various movements. So the women's movement for suffrage kind of split. The mainstream part of it decided the best thing to do was to support the war effort and kind of back off a little bit on pushing for suffrage until the war was over, and then go forward and suffrage would go on. The National Women's Party, which Sarah Coleman was part of, had a different view. They said, here's Woodrow Wilson going out around the world saying this is a war for democracy, and yet he can't get his own party to vote for suffrage in Congress. And so they started picketing at the White House, and they got arrested. Sarah Coleman went to jail twice. So anyway, it's an interesting part of that whole debate. And then finally, Ambrose Teague was a big power lawyer in St. Paul. He actually wrote the statute that created the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, and then became its chief counsel. And after the war, his career continued to blossom. He did really well representing corporations, etc. Bought a big mansion on Summit Avenue in St. Paul. And then he came to a sad end. I was going to say that my favorite part of the book, personally, is the last part called the epilogue, where I trace what happened to these various characters that I traced after the war. What impact did the war have on them, starting with McGee and Lindbergh. And I end with Ambrose Teague, and I don't want to tell you too much what goes on in the epilogue, because there's interesting stories there, but what happened, I'll just mention this. On November 11th, 1928, which happened to be the 10th anniversary of the armistice, he shot himself in his mansion on Summit Avenue, killed himself. And I don't know whether the date that he chose to take his life had any significance, but there it was. That's what happened. There was some evidence that he was somewhat troubled by what he had done with the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, not so much what he had done, but that he had created this institution that John McGee kind of took over and did things that maybe were beyond what Ambrose Teague had hoped for. So what I'd like to do, if I just have a minute or so, I think I do, I wanted to read
Two.
Two?
See how much time you have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just two excerpts to give you a flavor of the book, and also some of the characters that we're talking about. And this first one actually involves this character. There he is, James Manahan. And James Manahan was a lawyer in St. Paul who, his whole career he was representing farmers or trade unions. That was basically what he did. And so when the Nonpartisan League got started in St. Paul, he basically signed on as a lawyer for the Nonpartisan League. So, so I mentioned out in the counties, especially in those southern tier of counties, there was really difficult for the Nonpartisan League to operate. And one of the ways that made it very difficult was that some county attorneys not only ordered that the Nonpartisan League never come to their county, but if they did come to their county, they would prosecute them for some crime or another. And the very beginning of this prosecution, this is only the very beginning of it, but it turned out this way. The first attempt by a county attorney to prosecute an NPL speaker, Nonpartisan League speaker, was a clumsy one, more of a farce than a crime drama, although it could have easily have denigrated into a lynching. When Jackson County officials got wind of a Nonpartisan League meeting scheduled for January 23rd in Lakefield, E.H. Nicholas, who was the county attorney, wrote a letter to the Nonpartisan League promising to use every measure at our disposal to prevent you from speaking here and to prevent your organization from holding any future meetings in this county. I mean, if you think about it, this is like if say there's a Republican county attorney and he said, Democrats could never campaign here anymore. That's it. I just said it. That's it. You're done. That's basically what was going on. Well, Joseph Gilbert, who was kind of second in command of the Nonpartisan League after Arthur Townley, decided that he would go to Lakefield and kind of challenge this order. So he did. He went to Lakefield and he stood on a wagon downtown and he began speaking to a group of farmers when he said, among other things, that some county officials spelled patriotism starting with the letters P-A-Y. The sheriff arrested him for riot. Several farmers made his bail and he agreed to return on February 11th for trial. And so when he came back for trial, he came back with Manahan and another NPL attorney called H.A. Paddock. And the original charge of riot had been changed to unlawful assembly. Looking back years later, Manahan felt he underestimated how deeply small-town business owners and professionals hated the Nonpartisan League. He thought he had made the prosecution's case look ridiculous. The pro-Nonpartisan League farmers in the courtroom were gleeful. However, after most of the farmers had gone home to milk their cows, the judge called an evening session. During an extended dinner break, the prosecution found new witnesses. Near midnight, Manahan moved for an adjournment till the morning. The judge refused, but did allow a man in the audience to auction a parrot. The parrot was named Kaiser Bill. It was supposed to be for the benefit of the Red Cross. Manahan saw a trap. If he bought the bird, he would be pro-German. If he didn't buy the bird, he would be anti-Red Cross. He outbid everyone and bought the parrot for $15. And then he jumped up on a table in the courtroom and started a new auction, challenging County Attorney Nicholas to prove his patriotism by bidding. In the ensuing uproar, the sheriff rearrested Gilbert. In a fit of anger, Manahan told the hostile townspeople that he would ask the farmers to boycott the town if Gilbert was not released. Farmers bailed Gilbert out a second time, and as the crowd grew more threatening, Manahan, Paddock, and Gilbert attempted a retreat. In his memoir, Manahan wrote that the mob caught him before he could reach his hotel. Someone yelled, "Get a rope!" He sheepishly recounted how he saved himself by telling the crowd that he was only a lawyer trying a case for a living, and that he had no use for those damn socialists. The crowd agreed to let him go if he would drop Gilbert's case and leave town. The next day, Gilbert was convicted and freed pending appeal. Well, Manahan did not stop representing the Nonpartisan League. He was just trying to get out of town. And what happened after that was County Attorney Nicholas and the county attorney in Martin County and the county attorney in Goodhue County formed a kind of a coalition, and they started prosecuting the Nonpartisan League leaders, including Arthur Townley, Joseph Gilbert, and any organizer that came into their town. And they lost some, but they won some too. And eventually after those cases were appealed, even after the armistice, Arthur Townley and Joseph Gilbert, the two leaders of the Nonpartisan League, served pretty long sentences in the Goodhue County jail. This is after the war was over, as a result of all that. Well, I want to read one more excerpt, and this has to do with the University of Minnesota. And I guess you could say academic freedom, which is kind of a big subject these days. It's about this guy, William Shaver, who was U of M professor. Actually, he was the chair of the political science department. So what happened was that John McGee asked Fred Snyder, who was a major big-time lawyer in Minneapolis, but he was also the chair of the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota, to investigate several university professors infected with the, quote, germ, unquote, of disloyalty. McGee wrote that the commission thought this matter could be safely entrusted to the regents, not surprising because Fred Snyder was the chair of the regents and Governor Burnquist actually sat on the regents ex officio. McGee attached an unsigned statement that claimed that all but one member of the German department was disloyal, and that in addition, there are two other rabid pro-Germans in official positions, namely Schaefer and also Alfred Ulrich, who was the dean of dentistry. Snyder consulted with Marion L. Burton, who had just become the university president, and the stage was set for an inquisition. When summoned before the regents in late summer, most of the professors, including all the German language faculty, established their loyalty. On September 13th, the board interrogated the last two, Dean Aker and Schaefer. The regents concluded that Aker, a mild-mannered pacifist, was a harmless eccentric, and they sent him back to work in the dentistry department. Burton then summoned Schaefer and informed him that the regents wanted to question him about his loyalty. With no idea why this was happening and no time to prepare, Schaefer was ushered into the boardroom. What happened next marks a low point in the university's history. William Schaefer was born in La Crosse, son of German immigrants. The University of Minnesota hired him in 1901, shortly after he had completed his doctorate at Columbia University. By 1917, he was the chair of the political science department and a respected scholar. Shaper bristled at what he felt were ridiculous insinuations and a humiliating process. He told the regents that although he did not oppose the war effort, he could not, quote, boost for the war, unquote, because he had relatives fighting on both sides. When asked what he meant by boosting, he replied that it is revolting to my conscience to go out and harangue public meetings for the purpose of arousing the war spirit. This response angered Pierce Butler, one of the regents, who was a well-known criminal trial lawyer, and by the way, a future U.S. Supreme Court justice, who grilled Shaper as Burton sat silently. "You want the Kaiser to dominate the world, don't you?" he demanded. Shaper, just as angry, responded that he thought Butler's question was utterly absurd. To men like Burton, Snyder, and Butler, however, the question was anything but absurd. They had internalized McGee's 100% loyalty ideology that branded a person who was not completely loyal as a traitor. Acquiescence was not enough. Boosting was exactly what they expected from university faculty. After almost 2 hours of tense interchange, the board deliberated and then fired Shaper by unanimous vote. The resolution terminating him said that, quote, "The university, the state, and the nation requires unqualified loyalty on the part of all teachers at the university, coupled with willingness and ability by precept and example to further the national purposes in the present crisis." The regents made clear that they had dismissed Shaper solely for statements he had just made before them in the boardroom. He probably could have kept his job if he had projected a more obsequious attitude. He was, however, in no mood to cooperate. Shaper left the university that afternoon unemployed, and he would not find another academic job for 8 years. So this word loyalty was really the key word. It was in the Espionage Act that people could be charged if they said something that was disloyal, and this is the word that John McGee used all the time. But what exactly it meant was kind of tricky. It could mean all kinds of things. It was a very loose word. It had no precise idea. So this is how it was used sometimes. Well, I'm going to stop now and see if we have any questions or discussions or comments or anything else. Yes?
Do you believe that the primary elections were held fairly?
As far as I know, they were. There was some grumbling by the Nonpartisan League, but no one really seriously, tried to contest that, in terms of a fair election. I mean, I guess what I'm thinking about is in terms of vote counting. I mean, no. I mean, the larger it's like no. I mean, if you are barred by the Home Guard and armed troops from campaigning in big parts of the state, I mean, that's not a fair election, right? I mean, but I guess what I was thinking of when you said that was just in terms of more of the kind of issues we've had more recently in terms of vote counting. But no, there wasn't any issues raised about vote counting. It was more a question of campaigning, and like for example, Lindbergh went up to Duluth, which in those years was kind of a company town run by U.S. Steel. He went up to Duluth thinking he had 3 or 4 halls rented to speak in Duluth and in 2 Harbors and Cloquet. And when he got up there, it turned out all the owners of those venues said that they had changed their mind and he couldn't speak anymore. He couldn't speak anywhere in Duluth. He was never able to campaign in Duluth. So I mean, that's the kind of thing, that part was very much unfair. But in terms of actual counting the votes, I mean, I think what we see is probably pretty accurate. Yep.
I see in that earlier picture of the Home Guard, there was a couple of them younger guys, You said most of the Home Guard were beyond draft.
Yeah.
Well, they looked young. Was there some power play?
No, they made it. I think that probably the cutoff was 30.
Okay.
So they probably early 30s, and
Okay.
So I don't think.
I mean, was there some favoritism?
No, I don't think so, because no.
Okay.
I know. I mean, they were no.
Okay.
It just wouldn't make sense for them to do that. I mean, they're going around chasing all kinds of other people around the state for being slackers for avoiding the draft. They're not about to do it themselves. Yeah. And so so I think I would imagine that many of the Home Guard guys were kind of younger professionals, younger businessmen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, if you're 60, you're not going to be out there doing that, or you could be, but I mean, God forbid, of course you could. But they're probably younger professionals and business people. Yeah.
A couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, did a lot of these organizations disband after World War I?
Yeah.
Secret Service and some of these other.
Well, the American Protective League kind of overreached and did itself in. So one of the things the American Protective League did in Minnesota, and actually they started doing this, they were like, Minnesota was the first place they did it, was these things called the slacker raids. And so the idea was to try to find people who were avoiding the draft in sort of a mass way, not by investigating individual people, but by actually arresting a whole bunch of people at once and seeing who didn't have their draft papers with them. So they started doing this in downtown St. Paul, downtown Minneapolis, and downtown Duluth, where they would cordon off all of the downtown or a big chunk of the downtown on a Saturday night, when people were downtown in the pool halls and the movie theaters and theaters, and then when people tried to go home, all the men were pulled, young men were pulled aside and demanded to see their draft papers. A lot of guys had not gone to the pool hall with their draft papers on a Saturday night, so they all got arrested and held in some bullpen sort of jail until someone, their wife, their girlfriend or whatever, their mother had brought their draft papers down. And they did find a few slackers that way, but it was incredibly disruptive. And these things kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until finally in the fall of 1918 in New York City, the American Protective League organized the slacker raid that went on for 3 days involving most of Manhattan. And it kind of brought commerce in the nation's economic capital to a halt. And at that point, the business community and even conservative senators said, wait a minute, who are these guys? I mean, they're not even cops. I mean, how could they stop commerce in New York for 3 days? This is crazy. And so that kind of, the American Protective League kind of overplayed its hand, and after that, it kind of, the Justice Department had to back off because these guys had just gotten out of control and started actually hurting business, which was, that sort of. So, yeah, another way, I think.
And the commission. And the Commission for Public Safety.
The Commission for Public Safety, I'd say to its credit, when the armistice came, they realized that their days were over. And so that was November of 1918, and they kind of wrapped up during 1919. And the legislature was coming back into session in April of 1919, so their kind of reason for being was going to be gone. So there was an effort to try to preserve some of the things they had created. They tried to institutionalize the motor corps, and there's a huge backlash from the labor movement because the labor movement realized that the motor corps was basically organized against them, not against anybody else. And so most of those things kind of fell by the wayside. And then basically it just came back to a normal National Guard, set up as before.
And did some of these cases ever get pushed up to higher courts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Joseph Gilbert, one of his sedition cases in Goodhue County went all the way to the Supreme Court. The problem was, in those days, the U.S. Supreme Court basically took the position that freedom of speech was drastically limited during wartime, and so they affirmed his conviction ultimately. That's why he ended up spending time in jail in Goodhue County way after the war was over. But the way people who study the development of civil liberties in the U.S. tell the story, there was quite a backlash to what had happened during World War I in terms of free speech, and that kind of started changing things. And in the Gilbert case, for example, there was one dissent, saying that, wait a minute, he shouldn't be prosecuted for speaking his mind, and then eventually that changed, and you get a whole new approach to First Amendment law around the so-called clear and present danger test, etc., which was created in the 1920s to say that, if you yell fire in a crowded theater or whatever, then that's not allowed, but just speaking generally in a critical way of the government or the war is covered by free speech unless it would have immediate negative impact somehow. But all that development of First Amendment law happened after World War I, and so the Supreme Court was no help at all during World War I. However, I should have said earlier that there was the Federal Espionage Act, and a lot of people were prosecuted under that, but then the state of Minnesota passed its own Sedition Act, and there was many more prosecutions locally. That's what these 3 county attorneys in southern Minnesota were using, the State Sedition Act. And occasionally the Minnesota Supreme Court did reverse some of those cases. And one of them I was just talking in St. James today was in Watonwan County, and this is how crazy it got though. So in St. James, there's a traveling salesman in a hotel on the second floor, and he leans out of his window, and below him in the window in an alley, there's these two German farmers, brothers, talking to each other privately, and they're grumbling about the war. So he goes and tells the county attorney these two guys are charged with sedition and convicted in Watonwan County, and it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, wait a minute. The statute is intended to stop people from proselytizing anti-war beliefs. These two brothers are having a private conversation. I mean, that's going too far. But it got as far as the Supreme Court. I mean, this is how crazy it was. Another case in Watonwan County was a German farmer who was accused of saying, you know who built this county? It was us Germans. He was actually taken to trial, charged by the county attorney, taken to trial. He was actually acquitted by the jury because, as his lawyer pointed out, he never even mentioned the war. He was just not talking about it. The war didn't even come up. They said, well, wait a minute, but that's how, I mean, people were being prosecuted, like in some of those counties, for all kinds of crazy things. And sometimes the Supreme Court, the Minnesota Supreme Court said that's going too far. Another case was some local people came to someone's house, some farmer's house, trying to get him to contribute to the Red Cross, and they kind of pushed their way into his house, a whole bunch of them. And they're in his house, and he kind of lost his head and said something he shouldn't have said about the war. But the Supreme Court reversed that conviction too. They said, you know, this guy, he was just in his house. He wasn't out anywhere. And you know, if he said something, it was only because he was provoked by people who had entered his house against his will. So they threw that out too. But that's the kind of prosecutions that were going on all over the place. It was kind of crazy. Most of those people, you know, they ended up getting, you know, 90 days or paying a fine or whatever in those local cases. The federal espionage, you know, carried 20 years, and not that you would get 20 years, but it was a much more serious thing. People actually went to Leavenworth for saying something in the speech. Yeah. Yep.
Did you, in your research of all the Minnesota people, did it ever get brought up because other people thought end of World War I is just setting up for World War II? Did the Minnesota people, did you ever find it in research where that was ever brought up?
Being during the war itself?
Yeah, or even after it was done, did like these big leaders in
Yeah,
Minnesota think
yeah.
that, oh, this isn't good, we're gonna have another one?
Well, so this is a part of a bigger question. I mean, there was a kind of a, let me back up a little bit. You know, there's really two strands of thought in the U.S. about supporting the war. One of them is represented by Teddy Roosevelt, and one of them is represented by Woodrow Wilson. And they were really very different. So Teddy Roosevelt's point of view was, we should go to war to build American power. You know, it was kind of a strong nationalist point of view. So the point was not to end all wars. He said that's crazy. We should build up the army and go to war so we can build America as the major power in the world. That was this kind of the power politics. Woodrow Wilson was talking about, you know, making the world safe for democracy, but whatever. So depending, a lot of progressive thinkers, you know, kind of supported the war because they bought into Wilson's idea that you know, this would be the war to end all wars. We were really supporting democracy by fighting this war. And so obviously many of those people, as they followed through what happened afterwards, were disillusioned and disappointed because it was quite the contrary. One of the things about Charles Lindbergh Sr. That's really interesting is that, and he wasn't the only one, but some people were saying that they did not believe that this war might be necessary, we may have to fight this war, but this war or any war is never going to lead to progressive reforms. If you're looking for democracy, you may have to fight a war, but war itself does not create democracy. It creates the opposite. That was Lindbergh's kind of gut feeling. So I mean, he wasn't prophesizing what was going to happen after the war. He just thought this whole argument that we have to go to war in order to promote democracy, that so many progressive thinkers were buying into, that just didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense at all. So
We're getting low on time here.
Okay.
But what do everybody think?
thanks for the questions.
Yeah, and thank you very much. I thought.